Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about the growing feminist movement of the 19th century. We're going to be looking at the causes of why women start to advocate for their rights and then some of the consequences of that as well. So let's first start off with just the general role of women in the 1800s or the 19th century. You can't really put one experience on all of these women because just like any group of people, they're really diverse. You have women in all different socioeconomic classes. You have women of all different races, ethnicities, backgrounds. And at this time, slavery is still in use, so you have, this free versus enslaved female experience as well. But the two kind of distinctions that I'm going to make right now are based mostly along economic lines. So working women versus the upper class women. So in the lower class, women who don't have a lot of money or wealth, a lot of these women are actually entering the workforce. You have the Industrial Revolution that's creating these jobs that women are starting to take. We saw that in the Lowell mills in Massachusetts. And what you also saw with women in the workforce is that they're receiving lower pay than men. And this is something that they start to realize as a source of inspiration to form unions. This low pay, the long hours, the dangerous conditions, stuff like that. So women would form these unions and they would go on strike to try to get the demands that they wanted in the workplace. But we also talked about how lots of those strikes failed. So even though these strikes are not being successful, the women are just fired and replaced, it is the beginning of a labor movement, not just even a women's movement, just a general labor movement that will continue throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. So those are mostly working free women, and if they're in factories, they're typically in the north. But let's talk about the upper class women. So for upper class women who didn't have to leave the home to help their family with income, there was this idea that the home was the place they should be. Remember the cult of domesticity, something we talked about earlier in this course, this idea that a woman's place is in the home to raise the children. And then even after the American Revolution, they should be spending that time in the home teaching their children what it means to be an American and patriotic and all about democracy. So going back to the idea of Republican motherhood. Well, now we have the Second Great Awakening happening in the beginning of the 1800s, and women were inspired by that as well to use some of the free time that they had to participate in reform movements, to go out in society and to do good things to better society to then ensure their salvation in the afterlife. So this is kind of how we see these different women of economic levels getting into the women's rights movement. Again, I know we haven't really talked about enslaved women at this point. We'll be spending a whole other objective on slavery itself and kind of what's going on there. So just know when we're talking about this women's movement, we're mostly talking about free women and mostly white women. There are going to be some black women that we do talk about that were influential in the women's rights movement and the abolition movement. But for the most part, it's mostly upper class, wealthy white women. We do see a important book that comes out in the 1840s. It was written by Margaret Fuller. It's called Women in the 19th Century. And this is important because it's one of the first major feminist pieces of literature. Margaret Fuller would probably be called a transcendentalist. She was pretty close with Emerson and Thoreau and that whole crowd. But her main argument in this book, Women in the 19th Century, is that women are being treated basically like slaves. And this is a very dramatic metaphor or comparison that she's using to say that women are in bondage in the same way that slaves are in bondage. So I don't think that it's entirely, we would say today, historically accurate or really even comparable. But the point that she's trying to make is that women are being held back by men in the same way that slaves are being held back by the system of slavery. Again, it's not the same thing that slaves are going through, but she's just trying to point out that the women are also being, held back and restricted. Okay, so women start to feel a sense of desire to change society, to participate in reform movements. And what they're also finding is that in many of these reform movements, like in abolition or in some other movements, they're being kind of pushed to the side. Men say, this isn't really the spot for women, women should stay at home. And so they use some of that fuel to get them to want to, kind of advocate for their own rights. And we see the very first women's rights meeting happen in 1848 in New York in a town called Seneca Falls. And it's known as the Seneca Falls Convention. It was organized mostly by two women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It's mostly women who attend. There are some men, and again, they're mostly white attendees. There definitely were some men there, like I said. There were also some Black attendees as well. Frederick Douglass was, probably one of the most famous attendees of this meeting. But another thing a lot of these people had in common was that they were Quakers, and a lot of them were abolitionists as well. So you can definitely see kind of how religion here ties in with some of these reform movements. And over a few days, they discuss these complaints that they have against the patriarchy or this male-dominated society, and they draft these complaints and these grievances in a document known as the Declaration of Sentiments. It is modeled directly after the Declaration of Independence. I mean, it starts out with, we believe these truths to be self-evident that all men, and then they add women are created equal. And they go on and they list all these complaints that they have. And one of the complaints is that women are not allowed to vote or to participate in government in which the government makes the laws that they have to follow. Now, this was a controversial thing that was discussed there. Some women were like, this is a really far reach for us. I don't know if we should include this. It might make people think that we're crazy or not take us seriously. But in the end, most of the people there agreed that if we're not going to call for it now, when are we going to call for the right to vote? It needs to be now. So it was included in the Declaration of Sentiments, and it's probably like the biggest and loudest statement that's made in that document. Now, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they work for women's suffrage. They're joined by another woman later on, Susan B. Anthony. She kind of becomes the face of the women's suffrage movement, especially in the late 1800s. And this is happening in the 1840s, and women don't get the right to vote till 1820. So this movement to get suffrage is going to last for, 70, 80 years almost, until it's actually achieved. So what are some of the consequences of this women's movement? Well, what we see is that women are encouraged to be on the front lines of reform movements. The abolition movement that we'll talk about later, which is the desire to end slavery, the temperance movement to ban alcohol. We have women on the front lines of prison reform like Dorothea Dix. They are kind of leaving beside this cult of domesticity idea and really becoming active participants in society. We also see that more women decide to get an education. By 1890, 1/3 of college students are actually females. And today, there are actually slightly more women in universities and colleges than men. I mean, it's not a lot, but like slightly, like 52% of students are women or something like that. Women also start to dominate fields that were typically dominated by men before. So there's gains in the nursing profession for women as well as the teaching profession. And even today, typically those professions are they're called like pink collar professions because they're mostly dominated by women. There are definitely men, for sure. But before the women's movement, like nursing and medicine and teaching and things like that were considered to be male professions. But like I just said before, though, suffrage is not something that's officially gained until 1920. And so even at that point, too, there's still many issues when it comes to the rights of women that, we're still even grappling with today in the 21st century as well. So really here today, we're just kind of talking about the beginnings of this movement, but it will continue all the way until the present.